Okay, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to the class again. Not really coming, but arriving virtually. Welcome, all of you, and happy to have my trusty assistants, Miss Sarah Go, Mr. Pierre Younan with us. Today, we're going to talk about Kurdish nationalism and Assyria. So we're going to explore this topic a little bit, talk about the Kurdish people, talk about their nationalism, and look at one particular example of how nationalism impacts cultural, archaeological, intellectual, literary history of the Assyrians in the context of how the Kurds view it. I hope you find that interesting because it has repercussions and consequences for our lives today as Assyrians. But before I begin, I'm going to give a couple of questions to Sarah and Pierre. Sarah, and see how they answer, and we'll have a little bit of an engagement before we get to the topic, and then hopefully we can come around again and have a bit of a discussion on these topics. So, Sarah, given what you've learned about Kurds in history, and I'm sure finding out about Assyrian culture and lore and so on, especially oral history from your own family, do the Kurds have a special place as villains for Assyrians, the bad guys in history? If yes, why is that? Based on what you know, of course. And does this carry into the present?
Uh, Thank you, Rabi. This is an interesting question, a complex question.
How
Um,
interesting.
Very. I feel like the relationship between the two as a whole is just very tense. I mean, you can't deny that. There's just a lack of trust on both sides, I feel. There's rivalries based in history on land ownership and religious factors, of course. Leading into certain conflicts, of course, we know that the biggest issues Assyrian faced with the Kurdish people was in the First World War that the Turks instigated, and those sentiments kind of carried to like inter-World War period as a result of those anti-Assyrian attitudes. Um, I guess it is kind of important to recognize also the Kurds themselves underwent persecution due to like the sequential Arab dominating governments, mostly in control by Arab nationalists. Assyrians too were dealing with these things as well. There were clashes there, certainly. And interestingly, well, history has shown that there was, I guess, a bit of cooperation at that point. I mean, there were some Assyrians who cooperated with the Kurds, toward their goal of establishing like a, regional autonomy. I mean, some Assyrians even joined in the uprisings against central governments in Iraq. Individuals like, well, my dad was telling me like Franco Hariri and people like Margaret George became heroes of their resistance movement. But I mean, in present times, obviously relations are better than they were way before. Yet again, I mean, we can obviously see the traces of these repeated tensions, like over land disputes, coercion, even, and just overall like political dominance. And I heard, there were Assyrian schools that were shut down, which is really a big, big issue, especially when it comes to our culture and, cultural transmittance. But it's just really a mixed security situation that the Assyrians are dealing with. Again, I feel like the present day relationship between the two just reflects a cautious coexistence with a lot of mistrust that I feel like just undermines efforts at like a pure reconciliation. Things are just lagging, and I can't help but feel that certain people just talk the talk essentially. But I mean, currently the patriarch of the Assyrian Church of the East resides, within the Kurdistan region. And I think moving the patriarchal seat from Chicago back to Iraq does mean something. I feel like that could represent hope for our people and for coexistence. Um, of course, there are still reservations today. Many Assyrians I've spoken with hold, a range of opinions on the issue, but I think further research and dialogue are definitely needed here, especially if we can incorporate perspectives from Assyrians living in the region and more open-minded Kurdish voices as well. I also recognize, I was telling you, Robbie, I recognize my own bias because, I don't live there. My understanding comes mostly from, certain accounts rather than direct experiences. But, and I was mentioning, I feel like people online and social media living here, um, contribute to a lot of really just, bad things that kind of affect people who are living in the homeland, and it just doesn't really, it's not good for anyone. So I'll just leave it there, and yeah, that's my answer.
Okay, it sounds like you're running for the mayor of some city. You're being very nuanced and political there, Sarah.
Very
Not sure
diplomatic.
what's going on.
Very
Uh,
diplomatic.
all right, well, thank you for that. Very interesting. Let's go for a more direct um, answer to, to a question. Pierre, can there be a reading of history that Assyrians and Kurds can agree on, or is this an impossible task? Why or why not?
Yeah, let me just say that that was a lot of nuance in that last statement. I really felt like Sarah, you do a great job running for political office, avoiding a lot of touchy topics there. Just you should be a
She
tap
did a
dancer.
great
You
job.
tap
She did a great
did a
job.
lot of tap dancing around certain points. Um, I'm gonna give it to you straight, Robert. No, I don't think there is a reading of history that can be agreed upon. And what I mean by that is, I look clearly at other groups that have competing claims or competing understandings of history, and there's no way to bridge those gaps. Let's just look at something like Kosovo between the Albanians and Serbians. Serbians have a view of history of how Albanians arrived in that territory from their perspective, and that the land is rightfully Serbian, and nothing will ever change that. Um, Albanians will tell you that they have history there as native Illyrian people and the descendants of native Illyrians, and that they have been there since time immemorial, and Slavs are migrants to the region, and so forth. And there's no way to really bridge the gap on the history of Kosovo. It's one way or the other. And I think the same thing remains true for regions like Mesopotamia. Us as Assyrians, we have a history that specifically ties us to the land of Mesopotamia. We feel linguistically, historically, culturally tied to that land. Our reading of history and our understanding of history requires for us to look and say, Kurds are a foreign group. We don't see Kurds as a group that emerges until the 12th or 13th centuries. And for Kurds, and this is something that has become increasingly common in academia, need to justify their own presence in the land, rather than just saying, we emerged at this point in history, or we weren't a cohesive group until, a relatively recent point in history. Kurds have to justify their own existence and say, well, look, we're the Medians, we're the Hurrians, we're the Gutians, we're these whatever amalgamation of Indo-European groups. This is us. This is our land. We have been present. And in order to say that, in order to then justify their points, they then have to make history fit their worldview by saying, Semites come from the south, Semites immigrated up from Ethiopia at some point, or up from the Arabian Peninsula and immigrated to this area of North Mesopotamia. They're really not native here, hence our claim to the land. And all these Assyrian artifacts in the, you know, 6th century, 7th century, 8th century, 9th century BC, they're all very cool, but eventually these people are foreign settlers. So really they don't have a place here as much as we do. And really that's generally the Kurdish historical project. So no, we can't bridge a gap. No, we can't come to an agreement unless the whole idea of Kurdish nationalism wants to be undermined, unless the whole idea of it needs to fundamentally change. So no, I don't see a way of bridging the gap in terms of how we both understand history at the moment.
All right, so Sarah, that's kind of a disturbing answer for you, right? And you don't have, please, I mean, express however you, because this is a topic that a lot of people have agreements and disagreements on. And the image that you're looking at there is a very disturbing image, which is there's a Kurdish flag that is painted on Assyrian ruins from the 8th century BC. And why is it so disturbing? I mean, maybe we think that, look, in the Middle East, treasures like this are not really protected. But given the relationship that the Kurds have with the United States and with other Western countries, is something like this really defendable? Is something like this acceptable? Should this, remain for even a day in a situation like this? And there are, of course, vandalisms and so on. Now, by all means, we're not blaming every single Kurdish person or even the entire Kurdish government here, but this is a disturbing picture to see. And I chose to put it up to be a little bit provocative, but also to get us to think. And Sarah, I think, yeah, you answered in a nuanced way, true, but I think there's a lot of truth to what Sarah said as well. And I think it's important to see that, as well as you brought up good points. I'm kind of being like the Persian philosopher who was asked to judge between two people having, uh, contrary viewpoints, and he was asked, who's correct, and he said, "You're correct," and the other one said, "Well, don't you think I'm correct?" He said, "You're correct too." And then he said, "How can we both be correct? That can't be the case." And he said, "You both are correct. That can't be the case." So, so with that, hang on to your thoughts until the end of this little diatribe that we're going to go through. All right, well, who are the Kurds? Let's talk about that. They're definitely of Indo-European or Indo-Iranian origin, okay? This is a widely held view among a lot of scholars. Historians generally agree to consider them part of the Iranian family. There's various linguistic evidence to show that, of course, in their language, and there are various views of them migrating. And so there is this designation of being nomads, of moving around, and there are many theories that Kurds are not even one people. So all of the people that we know as Kurds, for example, the Zaza and the Kuramanji versus the others, there's a question of whether these are all one groups, and some certainly believe, speakers of one particular dialect or one language versus another, that these people are definitely not one ethnicity. And this actually is sometimes said by Kurds themselves, that these aren't really dialects, they're languages, they're Iranian languages. And these people kind of moved westward from where Iran is, either the Caspian Sea, south of the Caspian Sea, southwest of the Caspian Sea, and moved, or from the Zagros Mountains, moved towards the west in the area of Mesopotamia today. Certainly, there's something to be said for the various tribal groupings moving to kind of layer. Some are tribal groups in that sense, Ashirat, for example, just like the Assyrians. And then they move into areas where the riots are, where people are tilling the land, such as the Assyrians and the Armenians had been there before. And they kind of take over these areas through whether it's banditry or warfare or any kind of subjugation that the Kurds have inflicted on people like the Assyrians and Armenians and others who lived in those areas. And these people eventually converted to Islam, according to some theorists, and that's why their social makeup, their tribal makeup, their societies are different. So you have some Kurds that are kind of more tribal than other Kurds who till the land, miskine, some are called among them. So there are multi layers here, and There's also a discussion of the ancient origin of the Kurds, and that's really contested. Some scholars claim, especially early on, that these people are related to the Guti, as Pierre said, or to the Medes. There's definitely that theory, and it's been shot down by, I think, serious scholars. So we know that there are large groups of these people called the Kurds, or being referred to as the Kurds. And if we look at the map, we can kind of see these different groupings. Karamanji inhabiting, the area of southeastern Turkey, northern Iraq, in Syria, even Iran. Sorani in areas of Sulaimania, for example. Zaza, the Zaza in southeastern Turkey, that at times consider themselves separate than the rest of the Kurds, and at times consider themselves Kurds. And this map, of course, should not be viewed as, these areas are homogeneously Kurdish. That's certainly not the case. There are many Armenians here, there are Yazidis, there are Assyrians, there are Turkoman and others, Azaris, and so on. But the distribution is in these areas largely. Now, what are their numbers? It's very hard to figure out. And of course, when you talk to Kurdish nationalists, they'll tell you a higher number. If you talk to Turkish nationalists and others, they'll probably have a lower number. But by and large, people have estimated through various sources these people in their entirety to be about 28 to 38 million people. Now, that's a wide range, of course, and some lower it to something like 25 million, and some, which I think are exaggerated claims, are up to 50 million inhabiting all of these areas, including the Zagros Mountains in Iran, the mountains in Iraq, and then Turkey and Syria, all the way up to the borders of Georgia and Armenia. Okay, so as it concerns most Assyrians today, and as was pointed out by Pierre, of course, we have to see this is a region which is historically, I asked about history, and it is contested, definitely. And we're not looking for responses or views that predominate social media, which can be very abusive at times, unreasonable, um, not really based on anything historical, based more not on legitimate sources, historical scholarly sources, really just expressions of hatred of one ethnic group or another. And we're not talking about that. We're talking about how do the governments, how do established educational institutions view things, view history, view linguistic makeup of people, religious makeup of people. And so we're looking at an area which is known historically to be Assyria. And it's not simply something in the ancient past, it's also in the Christian past, because oftentimes we thought, okay, well, Assyria fell in 612 BC to the average person, and that's the end of that. And everything that comes afterwards has nothing to do with the Assyrians. So the Kurdistan region in Iraq concerns this, and provinces, they are in the provinces of Erbil and Sulaimania and Duhok. And you can see in this map that this territory, among the Kurds in particular, in the Kurdish regional government, there's disputed, something called the disputed territory. And this is even under Article 140 of Iraq's constitution. You see the lighter purple here are areas which technically do not belong to the three provinces that make up the Kurdistan region, which is the most organized Kurdish region in all of the countries that we discussed. And then you see the darker green are areas that are claimed by the KRG, or the Kurdistan regional government. but are not under their control. So the light purple there, as well as we can see in the description below, is the areas that are controlled by the Kurdistan regional government, and the dark green are areas that they're trying to control those areas, and currently they're under predominantly Iranian dominated or Iranian supported Iraqi militias and the Iraqi army in those areas. But the border as it stands between the Kurdish regional government and the Iraqi government, the central government of Iraq, is basically what you see here, going all the way from the north to the south. And the disputed area, a lot of Assyrians think the disputed area is really the Nineveh Plain, but it runs the border, a very long border there between Iran all the way to Turkey and Syria. So now the Kurdistan regional government has definitely established itself and the Peshmerga as being a very significant presence. It has earned the support of the United States and Israel more than anybody else. Israel, in particular, has had a long relationship with the KRG and with other Kurdish groups, but in particular with the KRG since the 1950s. Here you see a photograph, a very interesting photograph of Mossad's head in Israel about 1966, meeting with Mullah Mustafa Barazani and Mir Amit. And he's also sitting with two other agents, and Israeli agents of the Mossad had connections with many of the Peshmergas, including the Assyrian leadership that worked with the Peshmergas. Sarah pointed out a few people like Margaret, and there are others that are much more revered. Franco Hariri, who was assassinated, Hormuz Chikku, who was very well known, and others. And so there has been a history of cooperation. Of course, Israel views this under the lens of the periphery doctrine, which is the areas peripheral to Israel to be created in a manner that is friendly to Israel. And so the Kurds are definitely in that peripheral zone. And these relations go back in time, not just for political reasons, but also because there were Jews in Iraq from the ancient times, largely converts who we can call Assyrian Jews, also known as Kurdish Jews, who were airlifted with the assistance of the Kurdish groups in Iraq, the Peshmergas and others, Mullah Mustafa Barazani and others, and they were transported from Iraq, which was their native home, northern Iraq specifically, or Syria, one could say, and they were transported to Israel. And they're living there today, and they speak, guess what language? Not Kurdish, really. They speak, although they speak Kurdish, of course, because they come from there, but their native language is Aramaic, like the Assyrians, because they were Assyrians who converted to Judaism long ago. And we're going to mention that throughout this history. And the Kurds also feel that the Jews and the Kurds share many things. So there is this view that they have a common history of genocides, repression, exile, displacement. So there's a lot of sympathy going back and forth intellectually here. And our history tells us also Qadiri, who's a Kurdish activist and filmmaker. Our history and sacrifices are similar, and we were two nations that no one supported in all the sufferings that has come upon us. Our relationships date back to the late 1950s or even before. These relations have always been in the interest of both sides. Over the decades, these relationships have grown economically, culturally, commercially, socially, politically, and security-wise. And that's absolutely correct. Israel has a very good relationship with the Kurds of Iraq in particular, but also Kurds of Syria. And so that is a very important factor in the way that Kurds view themselves and the confidence that they have of their political and military power and their alliance structures, if you will. Now, one author tells us as to what the Kurdish people want. I mean, there's no such thing as a Kurdish will, if you want to view it that way. Although most Kurdish nationalists nurture the dream of a united and independent Kurdistan, the leaders of the Iranian and Iraqi Kurds have, for pragmatic reasons, usually restricted their demands to self-determination within the framework of existing states. So Iraqi Kurds don't much care about, I mean, they'll give lip service, of course, about the Kurds of Turkey, for example, or those in Iran. Now, if they can, they will link together to form an alliance, but these alliances are oftentimes ephemeral. And the Kurds really, in the area of Iraq in particular, care about economic and cultural rights much more than political rights. Now, they were prompted by others and sometimes by themselves, of course, to demand an independent state, but this was not to be, and they're just fine with that. Right now, they're fine with that, but they want to create a region without officially it being a political entity, a political state, that nevertheless looks like a state, acts like a state, is structured much like a state, and it has its own military. And you know, the old saying, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. For all practical purposes, the Kurdistan regional government has acted like a separate state. Now, this is not representative of all the Kurds in Turkey, in Syria, and Iran, certainly in Iraq, but it has acted like a state, a Kurdish state. And one could say they have succeeded in basically having an economic structure, a military structure, a political structure that has gained support from the West. And it has, when given orders by the central government of Iraq, for example, we actually heard many complaints about this. When the Iraqi government gives orders and creates judgments, for example, in the central court in Iraq or the Supreme Court of Iraq, the Kurds choose to disregard it. So much so that in over 200 cases where the Iraqi government has ordered the Kurdish regional government to act in a certain way, they have completely declined to do so. And they feel very confident because they are supported by the United States. Washington, D.C. supports the Kurds to ignore the demands of the central government. And that's the way things have proceeded for so long. Now, historically, Kurdish intellectuals oftentimes view themselves as very ancient, as Pierre pointed out, and this is because they are looking for the legitimacy that they unfortunately lack in terms of a literary history, other than, you know, a couple of cases, Sharifnama being one of them, which has been misinterpreted. It's a work of the um, 16th century. But modern Kurds approach, according to one author who was very well known as to the study of the Kurdish language, Dr. McKenzie tells us the modern Kurds approach to history is also refreshingly simple. He's got a little bit of sarcasm here. Feeling a need for heroic ancestors and finding the imperial Medes, so to speak, unemployed, they make no bones about casting them in the picture. There's a little mistake there. Indeed, it is now fashionable among them to use a so-called median era obtained by adding to our date the figure 612, the date of the conquest of Nineveh by the Medes. And this was repeated on and on, of course, because there were some people who supported the Kurds in viewing their history as being descendants of the Medes. And so we've been around for a very long time, and we've been in this area for a very long time. There are not much in terms of Median ruins, by the way. Archaeologists have a tough time finding the material evidence for a Mede culture or even a Mede empire. We talk about a Mede empire, but there's really very little evidence of such a thing. But there's this constant reference, and I recall seeing an article in the National Geographic magazine, which was very sympathetic to the Kurds, and it had a picture of these Kurds sitting somewhere by the mountain and saying their ancestors destroyed, the evil, wicked Nineveh. These are the descendants of the Medes, and they're, still around today. So there is this constant claim. And now within this is the example that we want to look at, which is Erbil. Erbil presents us a case study of an Assyrian city, clearly Assyrian, that has been reinterpreted as kind of maybe Assyrian, maybe a little Assyrian, but not that much. And the reason is because the Assyrians are viewed, as we will see very carefully, as one layer among many. And it's regrettable that this has become sort of internalized by Assyrians themselves. And here we have an article written by Dr. Adid Miri, who writes for the Chaldean News in the Michigan area just this year. Over thousands of years, the Citadel has been home to, and I want to break this down because I think it's important, home to Sumerians, Akkadians, Hittites, Assyrians, Babylonians, Achaemenids, Parthians, Greeks, Romans, Sassanids, Muslims, Timurids, Mongols, Ottomans, and today the Kurds. So why are we doing this? Where do we get that this has been home to the Sumerians, first and foremost? Where do we see there are perhaps references to Erbil in Sumerian writings, but there's certainly no evidence of the existence of Sumerians in this northern town in Assyria, in the heartland of Assyria. The same goes for people known as Akkadians. And certainly the same goes for people named the Hittites. There's no evidence of the existence of a people called Hittites. That leaves us with Assyrians. That's definitely true. Well, what about the Babylonians? Well, the Babylonians come from Babylon. They're, it's like saying the Ninevites living in Erbil, considered Erbil home. If they lived in Erbil, they will be Erbilites. They will be Assyrians in effect. The Achaemenids, the Parthians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Sassanids, later the Muslims, the Timurids, the Mongols, the Ottomans, all of these people had something in common. They definitely didn't consider Erbil home. They considered it an area they conquered. So they came, they conquered, and they stayed there as long as they needed to stay. The Mongols are certainly gone. They didn't think that they were part of the culture of Erbil. The Sassanids, now they controlled the area for a longer time. And certainly the Muslims still in control of that area. That's a religion, of course. It's not an ethnic group. It's not a particular cultural group. And the same with all of these others. And now one could say, of course, the Kurds are living there. It is a part of the Kurdistan regional government. That argument can be made. But I feel that this type of description, which is, again, regrettable that it is coming from one of our own periodicals, is limiting the existence of the Assyrians. As we'll see, the existence of Assyrians cannot be spoken about in the same vein as the Greeks, Romans, and Sassanids and Parthians and so on, whose homelands were a distant place. So what this does is create a history which is multi-layered to render insignificant the history of the Assyrians who existed in Erbil and still do. Here you see a picture from the town of Ankawa on Palm Sunday. The buildings are, the church building is similar to an Assyrian ziggurat, for example. And so we have this obsession on the part of many Kurdish intellectuals, and it is really rendering the existence of the Assyrians as insignificant, specifically in Erbil, but also in other places. And we are told by one Kurdish writer, as archaeological efforts continue, the Kurdistan region is poised not only to safeguard its historical treasures, but also to serve as a vital custodian of human civilization's earliest stories. With political will, international collaboration, which is definitely the case right now, and scientific rigor, Kurdistan is cementing its status as a cradle of heritage, waiting to be fully uncovered. And there you see Assyrian, the great Assyrian king Sennacherib in the image, and the description is sculptures and carvings at the ancient Halamata cave site in Amedi. So not even being described as Assyrian, very, of course, deliberate way of moving past the word Assyrian to move away from allocating to the Assyrians any kind of sort of legitimate native or indigenous status. Now, well, what about Erbil? Now, we know the history of Erbil from ancient times. We know that Ashurbanipal mentions it, and many other Assyrian kings mention it. It is very clear in Assyrian history that it was an ancient, a significant ancient Assyrian town in the Assyrian heartland. But we also know from the Chronicle of Arbela that early Christian texts about the church in Hadyab or Hadio in our language, this was written in Syriac, allegedly in the 6th century. Now, there's some disputes about this chronicle, whether it's legitimate or not, but there's no question that it tells the story of early Assyrian Christianity. It is central to debates about Christianity in Mesopotamia or in Assyria. Arbela is a major city in this, and it was ruled by a Jewish dynasty, a convert to Judaism. This is in fact attested to in history. What is it? It's a chronicle of the bishops of Hadio or Adiabene in the 2nd to the 6th century. It begins with Marqida, ordained by Mar-Adde, Shlicha, or the apostle. It's a story of bishops in Assyria who performed miracles and endured persecution by the Zoroastrians, largely under Sasanian times. It describes Christianity spreading under local rulers and governors that ruled this area. And many of these governors tended to be Assyrian, but they converted at times to Zoroastrians. And we asked, I recall, Dr. Richard Payne, whose focus is Iran Shah or Sasanian Iran, whether one could be an Assyrian living in this Iranian empire and still be Iranian at the same time. It's similar to you're an Assyrian today, but you live in America, so you're an Assyrian American. And that certainly was an interesting question posed to him, and we discussed it briefly. But I think it's definitely a possibility under these times. Assyrians were under the control of the Sasanians, who had a legitimate administration at the time in this particular place, but they also looked to their history as a point of pride. Christianity emerged in Assyria in the Parthian times before even Sasanian rule. The region was caught, and we've constantly made this point that it was caught between East and West in the conflicts, the regional conflicts between these two empires, the Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire, and later the Sasanian and the Byzantine empires. And still, they managed to maintain their Christian heritage and Assyrian background. And now, as to whether this is disputed, I would agree with those who support, among them Sebastian Brock and Edward Satcho, that this is a legitimate definitely a legitimate source for the history of Christianity. It was put together, published by Alphonse Mingana, whose birth name was Hormuz Mingana, and he comes from a family near Zaho. Writes this book in 1907 and which contains this manuscript that some have said is a forgery, but it is connected to other texts. It parallels the history of Mar Qardakh, Tash'it Mar Qardakh, who is an Assyrian character. It shares certain characters and martyrs in other legends. It's a blend of Christian heroism, narratives that are miraculous, and political struggle. It demonstrates the continuity of Assyrian Christianity. And it is in this particular area, which we think of at times like, okay, Nineveh fell, Assyria was destroyed in 612 and then later in 609 BC. But what happens to the Assyrian people? Well, Arbela was one of those towns, one of those great cities that never disappeared, never was defeated. So it continued to be existing as an Assyrian town during Christian times. And this particular source, which is one of the most important sources during this time, was written in Classical Syriac or Classical Assyrian. It is structured with the list of bishops. It is a mixture of hagiography and historiography. It ends with particular Mar Awa, with the Patriarch Mar Awa or Mar Aba in 540 to 552 AD. It is used to construct early Christian Assyrian history, and despite the doubts of some, it is a good source for the spread of Assyrian Christianity eastwards, which happened long before the Christianity spread to southern Mesopotamia, by the way. It shows the cultural exchange between Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. So the legacy is that it was a symbol of Assyrian Christian identity in this particular area. It combines faith narrative and regional history, and it offers us a window into how our ancestors, our early Christian ancestors, viewed their past. So the earliest evidence of Assyrians existing in Arbela is the late second millennium, BC, and up to the early first millennium BC. This is documented in particular by Middle Assyrian texts. And by the way, Middle Assyrian graves have been found in Erbil and have recently been dug up. So we have clear Assyrian rule from about 1300, I would say long before 1300 BC, clear that this is a city under Assyrian control, and that continues until the fall of the Assyrian state. Its name occurs in Akkadian texts. It is in Akkadian, and it was clearly an Assyrian city by the 13th century BC, and middle administrative Assyrian texts from Ashur and Kartakulti Ninurta refer to this particular city as contributing labor and goods to the royal center. So it was a part, an integral part of the Assyrian heartland. And we know that Erbil survived the fall of the Assyrian Empire, and after the Assyrian state, it remained inhabited and continued to be associated with Assyrian populations. And later, under Median times, we think under Median rule and Achaemenid rule, certainly Achaemenid rule. One could say Neo-Babylonian, although that's not much in evidence. Classical authors have mentioned the city as a major city in Arbela, in Assyria, excuse me. So after the fall of the empire, is it still an Assyrian city? To answer that question is yes, according to many historians, we have that. And this is the city near which Alexander fought his great battle to defeat the Achaemenid Empire in 331 BC. And clearly this continues the identity of Erbil as a Christian Assyrian city continues, and it's very clearly a center of the Church of the East, and it is identified as being within the realm of Author. A number of bishops are referred to as Authoraya or Assyrians, and I would argue that the word Suraya, of course, refers to Assyrians. And we are told by Patricia Crone and Michael Cook in their very well-known book, Hagerism, which is another at times controversial book, that Assyria, which had neither the fabled wealth nor the strategic importance of Babylon, which was to the south of Assyria, of course, where the Seleucids had settled and where the Parthians had also settled, as well as the Sasanians, had been left virtually alone by the Achaemenids and the Seleucids, or Seleucids, condemned to oblivion by the outside world. I don't necessarily agree with that based on the evidence. It could recollect its own glorious past in certain tranquility. Consequently, when the region came back into focus of history under the Parthians, it was with an Assyrian, not a Persian, let alone Greek, self-identification. The temple of Ashur was restored in the city of Ashur itself. The city was rebuilt, and an Assyrian successor state returned in the shape of the Klein kingdom of Hadyab or Adiaban. Now, why do we sense that? Because clearly there are these references to this area being Christian and being Assyrian. And we know also that Assyrians in this area converted to Judaism. And the conversion of Izates, we are told by Patricia Crone, of Adiaban to Judaism was re-edited as the conversion of Narseh of Assyria to Christianity. In other words, the Assyrians were monotheists before Christ and Christians after him, and the past therefore led to the present without a break. By the way, this is a very important point. Not many of our people celebrating certain sharas or festivals within Christianity realize that this monotheism that the Assyrians had, which is associated with Judaism, came before Christianity. And we still today celebrate Marchmuni, and she has this saint who sacrificed herself prior, under the Maccabees, prior to the arrival of Christianity, is still revered in Assyrian Christianity. So this idea of the past therefore led to the present without a break certainly is contained in the Church of the East history, and now, of course, in the Chaldean Church as well, the Syriac Orthodox Church. Thus, the history of Kerch Bet Silo, which is Kirkuk, today's Kirkuk, begins with the Assyrian kings and ends with Assyrian martyrs. Sargon founded it, and the martyrs made it a blessed field for Christianity, Mshihayuta. Likewise, in the 7th century before Christ, all the world stood in awe of Sardana, and in the 7th century after Christ, the saints took his place as the son of Author, Shimshit Author, and the glory of Nineveh. So what Patricia Crone and Michael Cook are telling us is that the Assyrians had a great deal of pride during these times, during Sasanian times, as the inheritors of a civilization as worthy, as reputable, as respected as the Sasanians had in their, say, reference to perhaps the Persian past. The Assyrians had a reference to their ancient glorious past, and they blended that with their Christianity. All this is to say that this particular very significant city, which did not collapse with the fall of Assyria, was a very important city for the Assyrian Christians, and continued up until today. But now back to Erbil. How are the views of Kurdish nationalists and Kurdish intellectuals? Well, Erbil, or Hawler, as it is sometimes called, is presented primarily as a Kurdish capital and the historic heart of Kurdistan, without a reference to its very clear pre-Christian and Christian Assyrian past. The main themes are Erbil as an ancient Kurdish city. Many Kurdish writers claim that the city's roots, as part of a continuous continuous Kurdish presence in the Zagros Mountains and northern Mesopotamia. There's references to the Medes, for example, as having a very ancient connection to the city. And if there is an Assyrian component to it, it is one of many, as you saw, Sumerians, Akkadians, so on and so forth. Reinterpretation of ancient peoples. Some Kurdish nationalists portray ancient Gutians, Medes, and even Hurrians as proto-Kurds, and by extension treat Arbela's ancient population as ancestors of the modern Kurds. I saw a very interesting Kurdish author refer to the Sumerians as Kurds themselves. So there's a belief that the Sumerians are actually Kurdish. Now, these acts, I call them acts. They're not serious. These are not serious scholarly works. They're acts of desperation, intellectual desperation on the part of some people. Now, there is selective inclusion of the Assyrian heritage. The Assyrian past in Erbil is acknowledged as one among many historical layers. And we saw this repeated in various presentations. If you go to the souk, for example, the shop in the citadel of Erbil, which you see, Assyrians are presented as one small layer of all these other civilizations, and the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Babylonians and the Parthians and so on and so forth are the people that come and go. And the Assyrians certainly don't take precedence over these others, even though very clearly the Assyrians have a significant history in Erbil, unlike other people. So how is it viewed in the end? Okay, so it's one of many. It is fragmentary. So Assyrian history is fragmented into different parts. There's the ancient Assyrian, then there's, of course, the Neo-Babylonian, and of course, before the Assyrian, there's the Sumerian, and there's the Akkadian, and others, maybe even Mitanni, you could throw in there. And then after, you have the Macedonian or Seleucid period, and the Parthian, and the Sasanian, and the Arab, and so on and so forth. And this is broken up as part of an ancient heritage of Kurdistan and not necessarily of Assyria. And so there is a rupture of the continuity between the ancient Christian and modern Assyrians. And, you know, this is viewed as, well, three separate histories. We find certain Syriac relics here, we find ancient relics here, and we find modern Assyrian relics here, and those cannot be all together. And of course, in addition to this, there is outright Kurdification of names, of history, of geography. And this is a very serious matter to be debated, to be discussed, and to be dealt with. I'm not necessarily offering a solution, but I do want to end on a positive note. And I think that I had written an article some time ago that Assyrian Christianity continues to assert its renewal in this very ancient city. And that certainly was the case when Mar Awa, a patriarch of the patriarch of the Assyrian Church of the East, who was born in Chicago, had served the church in Chicago for all of his life, then served the church in California, decided to take his patriarchy and go to Erbil and open one of the most beautiful areas, thanks to certain Assyrians, primarily Sargis Aghajan, Rabi Sargis Aghajan. With his assistance, this land was given to the church, and the cathedral that is built and the areas next to it are really a sight to behold. It's a very beautiful architectural monument to the history of the Church of the East. And perhaps, as Sarah had hoped in the very beginning of this presentation, that maybe there is some hope for Assyrians to reclaim their culture and their past and look forward to a coexistence that may help them maintain their culture and heritage.
you.